Okaeri! Welcome back to my channel, May Between the Pages. My name is Taylor, and today we are finally doing my best books of 2023. Now, 2023 was a crazy year. I had a baby, I had to adjust to family life, kind of get into a rhythm, and that really threw off my reading for a while there. So it's a bit of an atypical year reading-wise, but I will say that even though I didn't read as much as I usually would, I was much more picky with what I was reading. So it was pretty hard to narrow down my top 10. Basically, I made a list of all the 5 stars that I got throughout the year, or that I read throughout the year. And then from there, I narrowed it down. And usually I don't rank within the top 10, but I decided this year to challenge myself to try to do that. So we are gonna try to rank these, and we'll see how we do. Everyone knows that I don't follow my own rules though, so we will see what happens. So coming in at number 10 is Sapiens, A Graphic History. I'd already read the original book and loved it. It was a 5-star read for me. So as a gift, my parents got me the graphic history version, which is essentially a graphic novel, a version of the same content, but it's presented in a very different way. It feels a lot more personal, like you're kind of in a classroom learning from a teacher, which is essentially what's happening. A professor is teaching a young girl about everything and you're, along for the ride. So even though I'm not allowed to do rereads on this list, that's one of my rules, I'm not counting this as a reread because it's a very different way of looking at the same information. So look at me already breaking my own rules. Right, I forgot to say actually at the beginning of this video, my rules are that I can't do rereads and only one book by one author. Like I can't do multiple books by the same author on this list. Anyway, getting back to this book. Like I said, I'm not counting this as a reread, okay? I'm gonna bend my own rules a little bit here. And another reason why I enjoyed this book so much was the experience around it. My husband is not a huge reader, but he does read manga, so he knows a lot about that kind of genre. But we don't really talk so much about novels. But this book brought us together. We're both very interested in biology, in the origin of the human species, and so this facilitated a lot of really interesting car conversations or late night conversations over a beer. And I just had a really good time with the content of this book, like out in the world. So I have really good memories of reading this book for that reason, and that's why it made the top 10. Number 9, I don't have a physical copy of it yet, which is basically a crime. I originally read it from my library, but that is The Memory Police by Yoko Ogawa. This book is your quintessential Japanese fiction. It is very ponderous, it's not plot driven, and the ending is so open-ended that there really isn't any answer provided to you, and you kind of make the answer yourself. And that's something that I've grown to appreciate more the more Japanese literature that I read. But this one particularly struck me because of the beauty of the exploration of loss and memory and time, and how those things can all kind of mix together into this nonsensical losing of yourself almost. Basically, the setup of this book is we're on an island where people are collectively losing their memory. So all at once, everyone will forget what a bird is, for example. And in order to ensure that this memory stays forgotten, there are people called the memory police who come in and erase all possible references to that thing. So let's say a bird is what's forgotten, all the encyclopedias that mention birds will be taken. Anything that references what a bird is will be removed from the environment of these people. And there are a select few people, though, who don't forget these memories, and they're forced to kind of pretend that they have. If you're going to read this book, though, don't read it looking for the farther reaching implications of this type of society, what's happening around the world, what are the political ramifications of people forgetting things. Like, don't go into this book looking for that type of world building, because that's not what this book does. This book has a premise, and if you're reading it for the plot, don't, because basically we sit in that premise, we simmer in it. There's also a story within a story aspect here, which I thought was very beautifully done. It has a melancholy undertone to the entire thing. I would say that it is sad, but not like a tearjerker sad. It's a melancholy sad. It's a contemplative kind of sad. And I was just so struck by the beauty of this book. It made me want to read a lot more of Yoko Ogawa in the future. I haven't yet, but it's definitely on that pile, that TBR pile, that I would like to get to eventually.
I know y'all are probably sick of
technology malfunction disclaimers. Imagine how sick I am of having them. But again, my mic decided from this point on in the video that my chair squeaking was going to be at the forefront rather than my voice. So again, did my best to fix it in post. I'm sorry if it sounds like I'm in the middle of a large room or you hear my chair squeaking, but I really wanted to catch my full, unfiltered feelings about these books, and re-recording seemed to kind of take that away and make it less, less honest. So I really just got to get a new camera. I haven't done it because of the price, but I think I just need to because all of my equipment seems to not be working very well recently. But again, here's the disclaimer, and please enjoy the video. I'm really proud of it, and I love these books. The next book on my list is actually a SPIFBO finalist from this year. So this is not an official review for the results of the SPIFBO competition. Before We Go blog still has to release our overall score as a team. But this is a personal review from me, and that is Murder at Spindle Manor. I loved this book. I could not put it down once I started it. It is so addictive, and it's short. But the work that Stang is able to do in such a short page count, it's beautiful. It shows a real mastery of her craft. Even in the first couple pages, I was already immersed in the world. I was on board with the characters. There was not a word wasted. So from the beginning, I was struck by how immersive this world is. But essentially, we follow our main character, who is I guess you could say monster killer. And she tracks said monster to Spindle Manor, where she knows that this monster is hiding amongst the guests. So it's essentially a locked room mystery. But what made this stand apart from just like a one-and-done mystery book for me was, again, that world, that setting. The monsters included in here and their relationship to the wider world and our main character herself make me want more. I really want to continue and see how that gets fleshed out in later installments. But the pacing of the murder mystery itself is on point. This is a page turner of a book, and I promise you, once you start, you won't be able to stop. Okay, so number 7 was one of my first reads of the year, and it still made it onto this list, and that is The Hunger of the Gods, the second book in the Bloodsworn Saga by John Gwynne. The first one being, what is it called? The Shadow of the Gods. And then this is The Hunger of the Gods. This has everything I love in epic fantasy. Gigantic, epic world building that has wondrous locations, magic. There's a city within a giant snake skull. There's giant gods, Goliath gods, clashing in the sky. The magic in here is also imbued within the politics and the economics of this world. Everything in this world is so beautifully done and slots together like a puzzle piece. It all just makes sense. And then on top of all of that, we have 3 POVs, but one of them is a mom and on a revenge quest. And I've been talking about this on my channel recently. I cannot get enough of mothers in fantasy. They don't have to be badass warriors. I mean, this mother happens to be, and I adore that about her. She is a fantastically built character, but I just can't get enough of moms of all kinds in fantasy. So put all of that together, and you've got a recipe for one of my favorite books. I cannot get enough of this world. Plus, this cover art, it's gorgeous. This is the second book in the series, so I can't really say much about characters without giving away plot points or reveals in the first book, but just know that this gives everything the Shadow of the Gods gave and then some, if that was even possible. Like I said, we follow 3 different POVs, and in the Shadow of the Gods, that one POV, the mother figure, we follow her. She starts off on said revenge quest. The second POV is from someone who is of the lowest caste of the society. He's essentially a slave, and he is imbued with a remnant of the old gods' magic. And instead of that being seen as a gift, it's seen as a curse, and those who have the magic are then taken as slaves. So he is in that ranking in this world, and we start his story where he's trying to change that. And then the third POV is from someone who is the very opposite at the upper echelons of this society. She's the daughter of a very powerful ruler, but strikes out on her own to join a mercenary band because she wants to make her own name separate from her father. And then, of course, all of these POVs end up clashing and crossing paths in the most imaginative of ways. Like I said, it's one of the first books I read in 2023 and is sticking with me to this day, so I'm dying to get the rest of the series. Number 6 is The Lost Metal by Brando Sando. This one I really can't say much about because it's so embroiled in the Cosmere at this point. But if I have to choose a book that was the most fun I've had as a reading experience throughout all of 2023, it would have to be this book. There are so many reveals and connections made, Cosmere connections made, like on a broader scope, on a broader scale in this book, that I just felt like that meme of Leonardo DiCaprio, you know, where he's pointing at the screen, like, hey, that's how I felt this entire book. And it was so fun. Like I felt so much joy reading this book. I'm also very open about the fact that I'm a huge fan of Mistborn Era 2. I like it much better than Mistborn Era 1. Okay, don't at me. It clicks with me better. And I love Wax and Wayne. Wayne, he's my baby. I love him so much. And I understand why people don't, okay? I get that he's a very polarizing character. But I am on the positive end of that spectrum. I adore him. So this book just had everything I loved. It was so much fun. And I'm so happy that we're at the point in the Cosmere where everything is starting to click and make sense. I love when the Easter eggs start to come to fruition. So this was a blast, and it's number 6 on this list. Now, number 5 is very different for me. It's not a genre that I usually read or pick up, but I picked this up on a whim when I was in the States, and it just struck me in my soul, and that is What Kind of Woman? This is a collection of poems. The first part of this book is more focused on relationships that a woman might have in her life and pondering on those things. And while that part of the collection is beautiful and there are some great poems in there, what made this book 5 stars and catapulted it to be on this top 10 list is the second half of the book, which is about motherhood. As I mentioned in the beginning of this video, I became a mother this year, and so those themes obviously are going to hit quite hard for me. But the way that Kate Baer talks about motherhood it spoke to me in a way I didn't know I needed to be spoken to. And there are quite a few poems that I've just been referring back to almost on a daily basis when being a mother gets hard, or when you feel like no one's going to understand the way that you feel in that moment. These poems make me feel understood. They get me. And it reminds me that there are others who have gone through this process and who feel this way as well. So there are so many beautiful poems in here, but I'm going to read the one that convinced me to buy it in the bookstore when I flipped it open and read it. And it's called Good Mother. She lies on her back, open shirt like a wound, and waits for the start of her baby crying. What is it about the sound? A symphony of doubt. She walks into motherhood in the low light of morning. Now she sits at its feet in the dark and weeps. You are a good mother, they say. Blood at her breast. But what, she asks, does a good mother do? Outside in the garden, she pulls at the thistles and dandelion weeds, any sign of failing, any sign of immorality. It's so good. It's so good. I feel like pretty much every mother can connect to that. There's just a feeling that is evoked by the words chosen here that I hadn't seen elsewhere. And this collection of poems doesn't just talk about the difficulties of motherhood, it talks about the joys, about the contradictory feelings that exist simultaneously within you when you're working through this journey. So I love this collection of poems. I had my parents send it to me from the States, and unfortunately it got really beat up in the shipping process, which makes me very sad. But that just means it's going to be a well-loved book of poems, I guess, at this point. I just have to accept that is its fate. Poetry is obviously very subjective, as all reading is, but if you're a mom out there and you want to feel seen, I would highly recommend this collection. Maybe it'll do for you what it did for me. Okay, so number 4 on this list is The Fall by Ryan Cahill. This novella grabbed me by the throat and did not let me go until the last page. I started this when Hayato and I went to the States with Sumire, and it's a 14-hour plane ride, so I had a bunch of, books lined up on here. I could not put this down on the flight. I finished it in like one sitting on the flight. I was obsessed. Ryan was so in his bag when he wrote this novella. I read Of Blood and Fire and thoroughly enjoyed it. It gave me those kind of cozy, traditional fantasy with a little bit of a modern twist vibes to it. But I've heard from many people that he takes that kind of basis and then goes somewhere new with it. So I was very excited to see what else Ryan had in store. And The Fall, if it's any indication of what we're going to be getting in later books in the series, I'm so excited. It is a priority series for me to continue in 2024 because this was so good. It's one of those
Now we're in the top 4 books of the year, okay? So you're going to be hearing a lot of so goods, fantastic, like just a lot of not very well articulated excitement, because these books bring that out of me because I love them so much. This is a prequel novella to Of Blood and Fire, and it tells the story of the fall of the ancient civilization that we hear about in Of Blood and Fire. And it follows 3 different POVs, and they're all 4 different POVs, actually 4, and they're all deeply immersed in this battle. And not only does Ryan use the 4 POVs to show different aspects of the physical battle, which is beautifully written, by the way, very immersive, dragons ripping through the sky, epic scale destruction. Not only does he use the 4 POVs to show different parts of that physical battle, he uses them to tell you the story of why the fall is happening, how these betrayals happened, what the backstabbings were, what the political landscape looked like, through the different perspectives of people. And it never slows down for even a minute. There is no wasted moment of exposition here. It's so tightly woven and densely packed, and every word is chosen carefully. I am obsessed with this. It still lives rent-free in my head to this day. This is how epic dragon battles need to be done. And as someone who loves delving into the lore of my fantasy worlds, which you'll see in some of my other top books that we're going to get to in a minute here, this also captivated me because it was already established as the lore that people are referencing in the current day. So that's just something that I love to explore in my fantasy, and this did it to just perfection. Like I said, The Bound and the Broken is a high priority series for me in 2024, and this is the book that solidified it as such. Taking a little bit of a break from epic fantasy, though, in spot number 3 is The Black God's Drums by P. Djeli Clark. I read this book in preparation for the page-turning interview we did with Clark late last year, I think in October is when we did it. And I was rereading all of his Dead Djinn World novellas and A Master of Djinn, which I had already read in preparation, and I decided to throw in a couple of other works of his because I had the time to. And this is a tiny little novella, as a lot of his Dead Djinn works are as well. But he is a master at short fiction. The way that I talked about The Fall, about how every word and line has a purpose, that is how Clark writes his short fiction. Every sentence helps with the world building. Every interaction between the characters gives you more insight into, their lives and their nature. And he's so good at creating a sense of place in such a short page count. This is my first Clark book outside of the Dead Djinn universe, and it had lower reviews from those that were in it that I had already read, so I went in with lower expectations, but I did not need to do that whatsoever. We follow our main character, Creeper, who's a young girl in a alternative history New Orleans, and she's determined to get out of New Orleans. She doesn't want to spend her entire life there. And so she blackmails this captain of an airship to with a secret that she has overheard to try to, get on board and get out of New Orleans. And the dynamic between Creeper and the captain is so funny. I found myself laughing out loud often while listening to this, because I did originally consume it via audio, and then I bought a physical version immediately after, so I have yet to reread it and tab it, but best believe that will be happening. But I love the dynamic between those two, and it adds this kind of brevity, this lightness to a very heavy story in many ways. Clark plays a lot with alternative history, and you could tell he was having fun with this book, throwing in little tidbits to kind of give you a glimpse of what the world might look like outside of this small space. But then on top of that, we have gods walking amongst us in a way. And that is another theme that I absolutely adore. And it was done here with just the perfect touch. It's not overwhelming. It doesn't take over the world. It's just an aspect of this small novella. And I loved it. It was so, so well done. Here we go with the so good, so well done again, but you're going to have to forgive me, okay? It's hard to talk about books you love sometimes. We are in the top 2 now, so if you know me well, you probably know which 2 books I had to choose between, number 1 and number 2. It was a hard choice, but in the end, second place is A Legacy of Brick and Bone by Crystal Matar. I took forever to read this book, okay? I have a whole reading blog, maybe 2 reading blogs, because I was reading it for so long, about my experience of reading this book. And a lot of it is because of, as I mentioned in those vlogs and I think in previous wrap-ups as well, the themes of motherhood, parenthood in this book are so well done, so well put on the page that they were like bleeding into me when I was reading, and it was too much for me at times, so I would have to read this in small snippets. But rather than that going against this book, it goes for it, because it shows how well those themes were put onto the page. The characters are so in-depth, so well done, that they feel like real people. Wouldn't be surprised if I saw them walking down the street. She balances the darkness of this world, and it's dark, by the way. It's dark. But she balances that grim, dark vibe of the world well with small moments, small pockets of love or joy or human connection that kind of show why it's worth living in such a dark world. You gotta give us a little bit of hope, all right, Crystal? Matar also uses violence in a very specific and intentional way. While there's no large-scale battles in this book, nothing like an epic fantasy might have, the violence is quick, it's brutal, and it makes you cringe away from the page, which I believe is the point. Matar wants you to feel the heaviness, the weight of violence in this world, and view it as a genuine, scary consequence of choices the characters may make. And that's also a testament to her character work, because the people doing the violence are sometimes these characters that you've come to love, and you're like, oh, that makes me feel icky, I emotionally, morally do not like what you just did, and yet I understand why you did it based on the character work done previously. So it really makes you delve into your morality as well through these characters' actions. This book also has a lot to do with boxing, which, if you're a fantasy reader, you might be like, what, that's weird, I don't want to read about sports in my fantasy. Don't let that deter you, okay? I think it is so well integrated into this world. I also may be a little bit biased because I was in a boxing club in university. I've never done anything official, so don't go there with that. But I basically trained like a boxer, did a couple, sparring matches, that kind of thing. So I grew to appreciate the like mind-body connection that has to come with this sport. So having a perspective from a character who's in the ring was very, very gripping to me. And it added to the sense of tension. Like it felt like a string, a taut string, like vibrating through the plot. So for me, that kind of tension that was built up through the boxing part of this plot played really well into the political scheming that's going on around it. This is a ponderous book, a bit more than the first book, where there's a lot of political scheming being set up. Things are getting ready to kind of take off. And the way that this book ended, I think they're going to be taken off in the third book. But the first one, Legacy of the Bright Wash, I have a full review for it. It was also, I think, one of my top books in the year that I read it as well. And I fully stand by that review. I adore Legacy. So please go watch that down below if you want to know if this series could be for you. But the second book, Brick and Bone, second book of the year for me. And finally, the top book of the year for me, the reason that I don't do these lists until 2024 is officially over, is The Ninth Reign by Jen Williams. If you've watched my most recent blog or you've been anywhere near me on social media since I read this book, since I picked it up, you probably aren't surprised by this choice. I went into this book with zero expectations, and it blew me out of the water. As soon as I read the prologue, I was like, oh, I think I'm in for a treat. Oh, I am so hooked. And that continued throughout the entire story. This is such an interesting, well-done blend of genres. It's got sci-fi, it's got horror elements, eldritch horror elements, it's got a fantasy base for its world building, it's got animal companions, it's got creatures that drink blood. Like, there's so many disparate things that you think couldn't be put into a world and make sense together that are so well done here. They fit together like puzzle pieces. Like, you couldn't imagine the world being built in any other way. And yet you don't know what you're going to get. Every new world building aspect is fascinating, is interesting. I could not put this down once I started it. This book gave me that much sought after feeling of when I wasn't actively reading this book, I desperately wanted to be. There are a lot of things in my life that pull me away from reading at this point, and I'm lucky to have those things in my life. But every time, Hayato was like, can you help me with this? Or I need to take care of Sumide. I was lamenting the fact that I wasn't immersed in this world. And ironically, when you read as many books as a lot of us do, that feeling is even more special. Essentially, we enter this world in the decline of one of the greatest civilizations that existed in this world to date. They were the most powerful nation, militarily, politically. They lived very, very long lives, kind of elfish, if you want to view it that way. They're kind of elves mixed with vampires, if you need to put a label on it. But their name in the book is the Eborans. And we enter, like I said, during the downfall of their civilization. It is bereft of its god, and without the power of the god behind them, they lost their foothold in this world. And in attempts to bring their god back, they also visited atrocities on other groups of people in this world. So they've left themselves very alienated and completely bereft of power. One of our 3 POVs follows someone from that society, and then another POV is from the perspective of a fell witch, who is basically a witch who has elemental powers. But these powers are feared and demonized in this world, and we enter the story where she is imprisoned. And the third POV is very reminiscent of Lady Trent from the Memoirs of Lady Trent series, if you've read that. She's a quirky elder woman who is obsessed with her research into this world. She doesn't give a shit what anyone else thinks. And she is by far my favorite POV. I would die for her. The research that she's doing is into these things called parasite spirits, which have invaded and infected their world. Essentially, anyone who is touched by one of these parasite spirits gets turned inside out. Very gruesome, I know. And these parasite spirits seem to haunt specific areas where these giant relics of wars since past have fallen to earth. And they seem to, gather around these areas. And Vintage, which is the name of the character, the older quirky character, she is determined to figure out why. And finally, the last bit of information that I would give you before starting this book is that these gigantic relics, like I said, are from wars past. And those wars were between this kind of eldritch horror antagonist of bug people. They're not called bug people in the book, but that's essentially what they are. And throughout history, there have been 9 different wars where they've come to take over this planet. And the Aborans, who I mentioned in the beginning, were the only society who could stand against them. And the Aborans pushed them back every time. But now the Aborans are in their decline and they've lost their god. And so now this threat, this kind of unseeable, unknowable threat is starting to rise again. Guys, I know it sounds like so many disparate things, like I said, but they are put together so well. I am so impressed with Williams. I cannot get enough of this world. Not reading the second book, The Bitter Twins, which is behind me, this one here, was the hardest thing I've ever done at the end of 2024. Or end of 2024, I just skipped ahead a year. End of 2023, but I put it aside because there were some other books that I really, really needed to get to, or I told myself I needed to get to by the end of the year. And I'm currently reading a buddy read, but once that buddy read is done, I plan to binge The Bitter Twins and The Poison Song, because I need to be back in this world. It's not a want, it is a need. So if you can't tell the way that I've talked about this book and I can't shut up about it, this is my top book of the year. And I'm going to be screaming about it. And I can't wait to read the second and third book. I really hope that they're of the same caliber. The people that I've talked to say that, the second and third book are just as good. So if I love the first book this much, then I have really high hopes for the next 2. This could be one of those rare all 5-star series for me. It definitely is within the realm of possibility. So fingers crossed that that's what happens. As usual, this video is longer than I expected. It's only about 10 books, but, clearly I can't shut up about them, which makes sense because they are the top 10 books out of the, I think, 56, 57 that I read this year. Let me know in the comments down below if you've read any of these. Maybe you have completely differing opinions to me and you hated some of these. Also would love to have that conversation down below. It's okay to be wrong sometimes, so, I'll allow that. Also, let me know what your top 10 books of the year were. I would love to hear. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and click that bell. I'd love to have you as part of this community, and I appreciate it. But for now, I'm going to head out. Jenny!